doing planting models today. I also call it advanced planting design. So just think of it's either planting models or planting design. It's the same idea, but I should probably just quickly say my name is Lisa Nunamaker and I teach in the Department of Horticulture at Iowa State. And like Alicia mentioned last week, we talked about planting design tips. So those are kind of the, I don't want to say it, maybe entry level. I don't even know say it's entry level. Those are the basics of planting design. I mean, they're basics, whether they're entry level or not, they're more than that. But I want to make sure that, you know, those kind of the start. And then today I wanted to share some more advanced ideas or models with you. And I kind of see these as templates also. These are different ways you could arrange plants in a landscape versus the typical, you know, form, texture, color, those types of things that we talked about last week. For those that were not here, I'm going to do a brief overview. The first few slides will be a summary of what we talked about last week. So don't worry about that. I'll catch you up and then we'll talk about the models. And then I have some extras at the end. I'm hoping I didn't add too much to go over. So I'm going to kind of watch the time and make sure we don't go too over. But I have a whole bunch of cool things at the end to talk about design plant communities also if we have time. So we're just going to go and see what we can cover today. So the first thing I'd like to do is just do a quick overview of what we talked about last week. And we talked about the difference between spatial design and planting design. Because when I talk about planting design, which are all three of these talks that I'll be doing, I just want to make sure everybody understands the difference between spatial and planting design. I think oftentimes we think of planting design as landscape design, but it's just one component of it. So last week we talked about that spatial design is more about the overall plan, and it's about creating the spaces or the rooms in a garden. I always like to think of landscape design like the main unit of landscape design is the garden room. We're creating a room that has a floor, a wall, and a ceiling, and you know, we're living in that space, whether, you know, we're eating outside, we're playing croquet, we're doing the laundry, whatever we're doing, we're creating these spaces outside to enjoy and to live in. So spatial design is really all about that. It's about, you know, defining what the lawn space looks like in patios and your deck and all of those things. And when you define those outdoor spaces, that's what tells you where the plants go, because the plants are actually the floors, the walls, and the ceilings of the room. So we define what that room looks like, and then we use plants in beds around those rooms. So it's kind of cool. So it's, you know, I was mentioning last week that when you go to the store and you see a plant on sale and you're like, oh, where should I put it when I get home? Well, if you've already done a really great spatial design plan or an overall planting, or I'm sorry, an overall garden plan, you should already know where the beds are. So basically when you do spatial design, it tells you where the beds are, which are really cool. So planting design is what we're talking about last week, and tonight is how we organize those plants in those beds that will again be reinforcing the spaces. So we're thinking about form, texture, and color. We're reinforcing the spaces we created and basically figuring or maneuvering the plants around so aesthetically and functionally they work well in the landscape. And today, and actually I'm going to move my screen just for, I'm going to move my screen just for a second, because on my side of things, I have the little zoom things in my way. So, okay, here we go. I don't think you can see it, but I can see it on my end. So that's spatial design and planting design. So we'll be talking about planting design. And to me, planting design is kind of the second step after you've defined your spaces. But we'll talk about spatial design in another talk some other time. Let's talk about plants tonight so we can make sure we cover all the cool stuff. And it looks like this is being chopped off. So I'm just going to fix this quickly to make sure you can see what's going on. Whoops. Okay, so spatial design and planting design. So if this is a landscape, well, this is a landscape plan. The spaces, of course, or the rooms are these open areas where the lawn is. So we have like a laundry yard, we have a little reading nook, we have a picnic lawn. Those are the open spaces. Those are the rooms we created. And then the plants or the planting design are the plants in the beds. And again, you're using the plants to reinforce the spaces. So last week I showed this slide. What often happens is we buy plants and then we bring the plants back to our yard and I'm not sure how often we think about how the plants are reinforcing a space. Sometimes we use them to round around our house. We ring our house with plants, or we put them in places that maybe we're not necessarily reinforcing another outdoor room. And what happens is we create this negative space. The lawn should be a positive space. If you think about your living room or your kitchen or any indoor room, your floor in the room isn't just leftover space. It's defined by the walls and just what you want your outdoor spaces to look like this. So you want to design that middle space first, and then the plants are reinforcing that. So here's some more examples of that. I don't think I showed this one last week, but oftentimes we just put our planting beds. This is a plan view, a plan view looking down on top of the roof of a house. And sometimes we'll just put beds here and there. But what I'd love for you to do is think about, how do they work as units? How do planting beds lay out so they're actually laid out in a way that they're creating these spaces? So the light green would be lawn, and then the dark green would be planting beds. Now, I understand there's a lot of planting beds and you may not want this many. You could even break this green up, as long as that line is still a strong line reinforcing those spaces. But I like to use this as an example because hopefully it shows the point, how it makes it more unified when you're thinking about both the beds and the lawn being positive spaces. Awesome. So another example of spatial design, again, you're creating these rooms and then the plants are around it. And I always love to show designs like this. I always like to ask people, like, when you see this lawn, do you feel like that lawn was designed? Or do you think the plants were put in the ground and that lawn space was just leftover space? And how many of you, let's see if anybody says anything. What do you think? Is this lawn designed, or do you think it was just left over when someone went to the nursery and brought plants home and just plopped them in the ground? Some say leftover, some say designed. So hopefully it looks designed because it's very clear cut. It actually has a strong shape. And what I would encourage you to do, what I would encourage you to do in your own yard, in your own gardens, is design the open spaces also. So if you do have lawn, and you don't have to have lawns, I don't have lawn in my backyard. I'm not against it. It's just too shady for it back there. Think about what your lawn space should look like, and your patios and your deck and all of your open spaces, and then put your plants around it. So for this space, it's very designed and it's not left over. That's what I want your spaces to be. And just so you know, they do not, I love Kate. Kate, your comment's great. Looks like a miniature golf hole gone wild. It does look like that a little bit, doesn't it? But what I'd like you to start thinking about in your own spaces is, how can I create an outdoor room? First, create the lawn space or the edges of the space, and then use the plants to support that. And and I'm looking at Terry's comment about the hill. If you have a hilly site, really the spaces are about spaces that you can use. So if you have a hill, the hill might just become part of the wall or part of the edge of that space, because you may not have, unless you terrace it, of course, but that's a whole nother discussion. So basically you use the spaces you're creating are spaces you can actually use for something. So if you think about it that way. So here is a beautiful design. It's real simple. Some of you may not like it, or depending on what your style is, but whether you like it or not, it's still well designed. It has strong spaces. So the patio has a strong shape. Even the lawn has a very strong shape. It's a square. And what I was going to mention actually in the last slide that I forgot is that spaces don't have to be formal. They don't have to be a square or a circle. They can be very fluid and informal also. Even informal spaces should be purposefully designed and have really clean lines. So you can have very fluid shapes also. What I always tell my students is, if you can lift up the lawn space and it still looks like a great shape, you've done a great job, instead of this weird looking, shape that you pull out of the ground. But you want them to be strong spaces. Okay, so planting design, of course, are the plants that reinforce those spaces. So here's a space, the room, and then we have the plants around it. And that's what we're talking about today is, how do we arrange those plants in those beds? So examples of that here is a planting bed in Toronto, I think this was. And again, how do you arrange those plants so you're reinforcing the spaces next to them? This is a little patio on the right side. And then of course, some amazing plant textures. I took this photo because I love the plant textures in this. We talked about plant textures last week. And let's just digress for 1 second, but look at these large leaves and the very tiny thin leaves. Like what an amazing contrast. And I think this was in Toronto also, if I'm remembering correct, or Seattle. It might be Seattle. It actually looks more like Seattle, doesn't it? With those plants. But I absolutely love this with the large leaves and the small grasses. So just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Oh, we have some, oh, you go, good. Alicia's getting back to you. We'll answer those questions later. Awesome. You want me to answer it now? I can answer that question really quick. Aaron asked me what classes do I teach at Iowa State? I teach landscape graphics. I teach intro design, a studio and a lecture, and then I teach an advanced class. And actually the advanced class is where I teach some of the things we'll be covering today with the advanced planting design class. So hopefully that helps you a little bit. Awesome. Whoops. My PowerPoint is very jumpy today. So here's just another example of planting design. I love this courtyard space. This is on Martha's Vineyard this last summer. And just a quaint little garden, but again, how do you arrange those plants within those beds? That's planting design. Great spatial design here. Basically, architecture is taking care of it for us, which is really nice. I love courtyard spaces. So what we typically cover in planting design, of course, we talked about massing last week, making sure we mass our plants so the design looks unified. We talk about form. And then form, of course, is the most consistent thing. When you put most of your emphasis on form, your planting design is going to look amazing year round because of that, which is really awesome. And then the next thing we talk about is texture. And texture, I just mentioned this with that last photo with the large leaves. You want to mix large leaves and tiny leaves. That's the simplest way of explaining it. You can also have just different types of leaves, making sure that they're not all just long and narrow. You want to mix some round leaves and some long and narrow leaves, and different types of shapes for your leaves also. And then color, of course, is the other thing that we should consider in planting design. So all of these are very traditional. I don't want to even say traditional. These are kind of like the core for planting design. That's what we covered last week. And then here's some pictures of those. So massing, of course, plants, we talked about using odd numbers and massing plants. We talked about form and how all plants have a form, whether they're a tree, a shrub, a perennial. Once you understand plant forms, it's easier to make a composition of plants to emphasize a space or give interest to it. And then, here's an example of form that I used last week. Low mounding plants, we have rounded plants, we have, columnar, pyramidal plants, all kinds of cool things that you can do with form. And then texture is mixing, again, different size leaves. So making sure we have coarse, medium, and fine leaves when we're doing planting design. You don't even need color. If you have great form and texture, your garden is going to look amazing. You don't even need color, though color's fun. So we want to add color too. So it's form, texture, and color that are all important. So here's some examples of texture. Again, love these different all these different kinds of leaves, and when you mix them together, they're so beautiful. Here, I'm going to see. Oh, we can talk about the condo thing. Remind me. I'm sure Alicia will remind me of those questions later. So here is some great texture also of some smaller leaves and some larger leaves. Just absolutely beautiful. And then color, of course, is the third element. And, you can go from monochromatic and keeping it simple all the way to being bold with complementary colors. So again, all of these are important. And all of these principles or these elements are important to consider when we move into the planting models. So what I'll be talking about with planting models is looking at larger spaces. And like I said, they're more like templates. Like, how do we now arrange these plants in a larger area? What are some different ways we can do it? So today's planting models, and this is the handout that I kind of see some people are having issues. Don't worry about it. This is what the handout looks like. It's this diagram right here. I don't have the entire PowerPoint, but I think just having this information right here is really important. This diagram was created by Alejandra Feliciano. She was one of my graduate students several years ago, and I don't even know if she upkeeps her website or not, but the Zealous Thumb is the website that she had back then. And what she did is she looked at different types of planting styles that different designers created, and she put them on this chart of the left side is the simplest, and then as you move to the right, it gets more complex in terms of diversity. So, and we'll talk about all of these today, but the handout that I gave you is actually the same diagram. It's just flipped on its side and it goes from the top to the bottom. And if we haven't gotten it yet, you will definitely get it. So don't worry about that. It looks like Alicia keeps putting it in there. So thanks, Alicia, for doing that. So that's what this is, or that's what the handout is. I just wanted to make sure you saw these so you can see kind of that range. And I think on the handout, I also describe what each of them are. So you have that information. So you don't need to worry about that. So let's talk about the first one, monocultural block. And I have my first quiz. Let's see how this goes. So Alicia, this is the first poll. We're going to try this. We haven't done this before. I mean, I haven't done it before.
All right. So I just launched the poll, so everyone should be able to see it now.
Well, this is awesome. So looking at these two pictures, A or B, I haven't told you what a monocultural block is, but by looking at the term, go ahead and type in the poll that Alicia just sent out to you, and you can just click on it and tell us what if it's A or B. Maybe I'll do it too. I'm curious to see.
Oh, I don't know if I enabled you to be able to do it.
Oh, you can. Okay, that's fine. I don't need to do it.
I can for the future ones.
So Alicia, do you actually get a return with all the answers?
Yeah, we'll actually have this data that we'll be able to keep if we want to of everyone's answers on this poll.
That's awesome. Some of these will be really easy.
75% of people voting so far.
That's awesome. So some of these will be really easy. Like I feel like this is one of the easier ones. And then
so we'll give you guys another 15 seconds to get your answers in if you haven't voted yet and you want to vote in the poll.
We have a lot of consistency. So are all of these A's that are popping up, is that people actually answering the poll?
Yes. So we're going to end the poll now.
Awesome. I was just curious if that was what that was. Cool.
So we had 98% who said A was the monocultural block, and we had 2% that said B was.
Awesome. Awesome. So I know we didn't talk about it yet, but I thought it'd be fun just to show you some of these images. And like I said, this is actually one of the first ones. This is one of the easier ones, but of course, monocultural, mono means one. So a lot of you probably figured out that one means a lot of one plant. So the first one on the left side would be the monocultural block. So yes, the 98% of you got that right, which is awesome. And even those that guessed the second one, there is something monocultural about it in the respect that there's a lot of the similar color. So I can almost see why some people might think that B might be that also, because if you think of monochromatic, which is a color, I can see why you would think that. But in terms of monocultural, that would mean one dominant plant. So let's talk about monocultural blocks. So this is on that chart that I showed you, this is the simplest that you can go. And of course, very straightforward. I think a lot of people use monocultural blocks. There's two things that come to mind that people use monocultural blocks for: annual plantings, and we plant things in mass. So here's a good picture of that. And then we also use it a lot for traditional, like more contemporary gardens. And I'll show you some examples here in a second. But blocks can be annuals, perennials, it could be woody plants. It doesn't matter. It's perfect for someone, again, that has more of a contemporary landscape. Oftentimes you'll see massings of one plant and then you put them next to each other like in blocks. So that would be a monocultural block. So here's examples of that, of course, with annuals. And again, I would say this is probably what we see the most in terms of monocultural blocks. But I found this beautiful image on the Omi van Sweden website. They're landscape designers, landscape architects, and I mean, they're using hostas here, real simple, but it's very effective. So you can use a monocultural block in a very effective way to draw your eye towards something to, obviously in this case, you're reinforcing the walkway. And I almost want something like amazing at the end of that walkway. Maybe I'm standing, maybe the person taking the photo is at the point where there's a focal point. You almost need a focal point at the end of this, but it doesn't matter either way. It's still beautiful and it's very straightforward. Now, some of the downfalls of a maybe I should ask you, what are some of the downfalls of a monochromatic block? I'll just keep talking and I'll see what you write about. What can be some negative things in terms of a monocultural block? What would be boring? Some people say it's boring. Lack of visual interest. Let's see, disease is a good one because I want to make sure I mention that. Disease can be very problematic, especially, I don't know if how many of you know the story of the planting design at the Arch in St. Louis. I know that particular planting had a lot, I'm trying to remember, I want to say there were sycamores, I cannot remember. There was a lot of one type of tree planted probably in the 60s or 70s, whenever the Arch was built, and they all got disease and they all died, unfortunately, even though it was an amazing design that looked beautiful, but they were all the same tree. And as you know, Dutch elm, of course, is an example of that too. So it could be boring. It could be problematic with disease. It doesn't always have, it can be positive too. It's also very clean and simple. So if you are doing a more contemporary garden like this one, it might fit perfectly fine and it could be very beautiful. So it just depends on how you're using it. So there's pros and cons to all of these models, you will find out. But this is a very simple, straightforward one if you're doing more of a contemporary design. It's something to look at. Here's a traditional garden. This is funny. So this is a very contemporary garden, I feel. This is more traditional, but they are also using a monochromatic block. So you can see all of these are the same plant. We have a hedge. It's all the same plant. We have plants in the back that are all the same. We have another hedge. It's all the same. So monochromatic blocks can just be a series of rows of plants too. It's just that that block itself, whatever the block is, whether it's a row or a square or rectangle, it's all the same plant. But yeah, so sometimes it can be very beautiful. You just have to think about the context that you're doing it in, maybe the scale. You may not want to do an entire street of one tree because obviously if they get disease, we're going to have problems with that. But in a smaller scale, maybe that's okay to do a lot of one thing. So it just depends on, again, the plants you choose and the site that you're doing it in. So the monocultural block, of course, is the most simple of the planting models. And one thing I'm going to do for all these planting models is I will give you some examples of designers that have used this technique or this model. I love learning about landscape designers. I could probably just do a talk on landscape designers. I think it's important for all of us to learn not only past designers, but current designers. I think it's very inspiring. So hopefully some of these designers today will inspire you and you'll want to take on your own time, go look them up on either Instagram or go find a book that they wrote 100 years ago or whatever. I'm going to use a mix. So I'll have people that designed way hundreds of years ago, and I'll have people that are still alive today. So hopefully you can get a good mixture of designers and their styles. So for monocultural block, I wanted to share Dan Kiley. And Dan Kiley, unfortunately, is not alive anymore. He passed away probably 10, 20 years ago. I cannot even remember. But he was very instrumental in the modernist movement in landscape architecture in the last century. So he did these very clean, simple designs. And again, like we just talked about, there have been issues. I think Dan's actually the one that did the St. Louis Arch. But with that said, he's done some very significant designs on a smaller scale that are still around. So they are significant when you're using them in the right context. So that's really important to know. Another designer that I think is really cool is Roberto Burle Marx, and he is a landscape architect in South America. He's also passed away. Him and Dan Kiley are designed at the same time. They were both professionals at the same time. I think they both passed away in the early 2000s, so that time period in the last century. But Roberto Burle Marx was a trained painter. And this picture, I don't know how many of you know about Roberto Burle Marx, but this painting right here are a lot what his paintings look like, very 60s. You know, I just love that look. But his landscapes then replicated that. So each of these swatches would be one type of plant. He actually used native plants to Brazil. So he was awesome about using native plants. but he did them in this very monocultural block way with these really cool swirls and things that replicated his paintings. So really different approach. Dan Kiley OSC is more geometric, and Roberto Burley Marx would be more artful, more, you know, curvilinear lines, but still very monocultural block. Really fun. And I'm seeing that people are posting books. So definitely if, yeah, Julie, I always say her name. Heather, I see that you wrote The Inward Garden down. I've seen her speak and she's awesome. So I have not read her book, but I'm glad you're suggesting that. Oh, awesome. We have other things too. Okay, cool. So here is our chart again. I'm just going to keep going through it and we'll talk about each one. So monoculture block, I think we got that down. The next one that I want to talk about is a mixed border. So we'll just slowly start to come out of that very simple approach and get more complicated as we keep moving across. So here's our next poll. And we are going to, you're going to tell me out of these pictures, A or B, which one do you think is a mixed border? And I know we haven't talked about that. A lot of you might know what a mixed border is. I would say this is probably the most common planting model that most of us do. I do mixed borders. Out of these two images, what do you think is the mixed border?
This one is a lot more split, Lisa.
Oh, perfect. I like when it's split. It makes it more fun.
We have about 60% of the votes in right now, and awesome. We're at 20% B and 80% A.
Wow, that's awesome.
So we'll give everyone just a few more seconds here to vote.
I love it. I love when things are split because it makes it more fun for me. When I'm in class, I like to have even more difficult, more difficult images so we can have more discussion, which is great. It's hard to have discussion, I know, with the webinar, but it's just as neat. Awesome. I like these both, but mostly A, or could be both. We'll have a discussion about that. Are they mostly in then?
Yeah, we have 73% of the votes in. All right, awesome. We'll go ahead and end the poll.
Perfect.
And we had 79% who said A and 21% who said B.
Awesome. And let's talk about both. So I circled A for the mixed border, but I can totally see where some people may have thought that it was B. Let me ask you this. I think we know enough information now that you can probably tell me what B is. What do you think B is? We've only learned one model. But the B, it's monocultural. I kind of laugh at that, like we've only learned one. So the B, I think, is more monocultural because you have a row of grasses in the front and then you have a row of hydrangeas in the back. Now, you could see this as a mixed border too, I guess, because it is a border, but it's not as mixed as it could be like A is. So A is more mixed. It has the plants more intermingled than B does. But B, I would say, is probably closer to a mixed border. But you know what? When we go through all of these today, when I do these in class with my students, we have lots of discussions about all of this. So I'm keeping the discussion short, obviously, because I'm the only one talking. But yeah, we could talk about a lot of these for days. So there's really no straightforward answer. This is just my opinion, of course. But a mixed border is typically what it looks like in A, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So basically, a mixed border is taking these smaller groups of plants and then just kind of popping them around, like usually like 3 plants at a time, and so how do I say this? A mixed border is just a whole bunch of small monocultural blocks, but they're in small groups. They're not just a long row. You're making a little group and then you're making a lot of them. So it could be annuals, perennials, it could be woody plants, it could be just about anything. And I'm looking at the comments. Patty, you are right. More mix of heights also, because a monocultural block, because you're using all the same plants, that plant's going to have one height. And Patty is right on it when she says that there's different heights, there's more interest. And I would say that that mixed borders are probably the most common. I don't know how many of you have a mixed border. If you tell me yes if you do in the chat, but I know I used to have a mixed border. We just moved. I haven't created a new one yet. I actually have another one of these planting models when we get to it. Lots of people do yes, because this is the most common type of planting model that we create. And this is what we see oftentimes. And I love mixed borders. And it's just a nice place to start for most people when they're doing planting design. They want to have a little bit of a challenge more than just a monocultural block. And I like mixed borders because when things bloom and take turns blooming, you actually have some interest year round. Whereas a monocultural block, you may not necessarily, you have interest year round if you're careful about texture, but obviously color is not going to last all year round with that. So I have this comment here, mostly primary plants. So that's a term I want to make sure I explain really quick. A primary plant is a plant that holds its own. So usually it's a blooming plant and it's really a showcase. So like a grass, an ornamental grass would not be a primary plant. That would be kind of the background plant. Usually it's something blooming. So most perennials that bloom, a shrub that blooms, something that's really showy, that's like that, it holds the attention of the whole border. So for the planting. So a mixed border is usually mostly primary plants. I mean, sometimes we'll put grasses in there, but I mean, really it's all about the flowering plants and they're taking turns blooming. And it's this whole showcase and it's this whole challenge for us as designers, like how do we keep something blooming all the time? So it's a lot of primary plants. It's a lot of plants holding its own. They're all competing for that attention. And it's really cool. It's really fun. So I'm gonna see really quick here. Does the number, I'm reading this really quick, I think it might relate here. Does the number of plants in the block for a mixed border depend on the size of the space? That's a great question. Yes and no. I guess you could. I mean, if it's a really large space, you might put more plants in but then it becomes probably some other kind of planting model that we'll talk about. That's a good question. I don't have a good answer, Sydney. I think it could go either way. You can keep all the groupings small, even if you have a humongous border, or you can make them a little bit bigger. But if you make them a little bit bigger, they might be the next planting model, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's see if this makes sense more as we go through these. So here's the example of the primary plants. Oh, and actually, one other thing I want to mention, Sydney asked, is it big plants, is it harder to truly mix them? So in a mixed border, this is what's so funny. We're not really, I mean, when we think about mixing, I think it's funny that's called a mixed border because these later planting models, I consider more mixed than this. So this is a term that's always been used. But really the later models that you'll see, especially the last one, is the most mixed. And some of you have the handout now, you know what it is. But a mixed border, I would say, is not truly mixed in terms of diversity and in terms of like intermingling. I would say the last planting models are more of that. It's a terminology thing. We're using a term that probably really isn't as truly mixed. Maybe there's a better term. Has anybody ever heard of a better term than mixed border for a border like this? You can let me know, or maybe we should come up with our own. But here, let's talk about primary plants now. So primary plants I had mentioned is kind of the plant that holds the bulk of the composition. So the one on the left is a mixed border. Heather suggests maybe just a perennial border could be the name of it. And a lot of these mixed borders are perennial borders. A lot of them have mostly perennials and not shrubs in them. Some of them will have shrubs, but I would say a lot of them are perennial borders. So a primary plant is, if you look on the left side, it's this entire planting, like it's mostly flowering plants and they're all holding their own. They all take turns blooming and they're all holding their own. But the one on the right is, whoops, it's just the pink plants. So the grasses are just kind of the background, but the pink plants on the right side are the primaries. They're the ones that are holding your attention. So, and we'll talk about the one on the right in just a little bit. I'll tell you what that is. But for now, know that the mixed border is a series of those primary plants. So hopefully that, everyone's giving me great names now. Vignette border and diverse border. I love them. I love them. So here's some examples of a mixed border. And again, very common. A lot of us have these in our backyards. And you can see they're just these clumps of these mostly primary plants throughout the landscape. And they are absolutely gorgeous. Like, how beautiful is this? This is amazing. I love these. Beautiful mixed borders, absolutely gorgeous. We can only dream to have borders like this. So I only have one mixed border designer. I'm curious, does anybody want to guess who I might list as a mixed border designer? I don't know how many of you know your history. I'm curious to see if anybody would know like at least one amazing mixed border designer from the past. Yes, Leah, I am impressed. So Gertrude Jekyll, very good. Several people got, and Rosemary Very. I'm glad you mentioned her too, Eileen, because Rosemary Very is also, I should include Rosemary actually. She's also a great mixed border designer. Monet, that's a great one too. I love that. Pete Aldoff, we'll talk about him in a second when we talk about drift planting. So Heather, that's perfect. I'm impressed. That's awesome. So Gertrude Jekyll would be a great mixed border designer. She did these in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and of course is the master at color and pulling all these beautiful mixed borders together. So yeah, I'm like I said, I'm really impressed. So definitely take a look at Gertrude Jekyll and read her books if you want to learn more about the art of mixed borders. And I see some other ones. I need to write these names down. These are awesome. So that's the monocultural block and the mixed border. So now let's talk about drift, since we brought drift up with Pete Aldoff. And we're going to look at our next poll. And I'm going to see if you know which of these is a drift planting, A or B. And Alicia has her poll up once again.
I just launched the poll, so everyone should see that on their screen.
This is another one I always have lots of discussions on. So which of these is a drift planting? Let's see. And I usually get a mix. People are pretty split on this one usually. So we have both. We have B. We have B. I love this.
In the poll, we have about 70% of the votes in. We're 23% A, 77% B.
Awesome. Awesome.
We'll give everyone a few more seconds here. So if you're voting in the poll, go ahead and get your vote in.
Yeah, we have people for both. That's awesome. Some both, some one or the other. And this isn't even the hard one. I feel like the next one's even harder than this one. Because as you get farther down in that chart, it actually gets more hard to differentiate between them. And at that point, you're like, it could be either one.
So we have 80% of the votes in the poll. I'm going to go ahead and close it. We had 22% said A and 78% said B.
Awesome. Awesome. And if we were together in the same room, I would definitely love to talk about this with you. So my thoughts on drift planting, of course, we'll talk about drift planting here in a second, are they're long elongated monocultural blocks. So they're usually these drifts, of course, of one type of plant. So it's like taking a mixed border, but now taking those little 3Z smaller areas and like elongating them. So I see B as being the drift planting. I'm not saying A can't be. I feel like A might be a mix of, it could be a monocultural block because the middle is all one planting and then you have these onesies kind of popping through. But I can totally see why some of you said that A has some drift in it because it has the drift of the plant in the middle kind of drifting through it. So this is where, you know, nothing's ever clear cut, and really it's your opinion in the end. B is more kind of where I'm going for with the drift planting. And drift planting, like I mentioned, is basically taking those blocks and then elongating them, those planting groups. And hopefully you allow, like, you know, in a border, a mixed border, I feel like we maintain that a little bit more, like we try to keep things like in a certain area. With drift planting, the idea is to kind of start letting those edges intermingle with each other. And hopefully blending, there's more blending that's happening as it matures. And hopefully, but you still see these drifts of the same plant, which is kind of cool. And actually, one of my favorite gardens is the Lori Garden. Actually, let's go back here really quick. I want to make sure there's nothing else I want to talk about. So the Lori Garden in Chicago is one of the best examples that's close by. Has anybody been to the Lori Garden at Millennium Park in Chicago? And if you haven't, you should definitely go there. I want to see, yes, so several, awesome. So I was there again this summer. My mom lives just outside the city, and the kids were like, we should go in the city. I'm like, when we go into the city, I grew up in the Chicagoland area, and when we go there now, we're always visiting the suburbs, and we know better. We should always take the train in, so you don't have to worry about parking. But we decided, let's just drive. I will pay for the parking under Millennium Park, and it was worth it. It was worth it. And we just spent like 4 hours just walking around Millennium Park, and they get tired of me, but I love looking at the Lowry Garden. I spent a lot of time in there taking photos because I really like to see not only the drifts of the plants, but I like to see the textures. So with all of these models, this reminds me that someone's from Mount Prospect. Awesome. Hi, Nancy. What I love about all of these models, they are still using the form, texture, color. Just so you know that. I want to make sure I point that out. And we're still thinking about massing. And even in the monocultural block, we're massing plants. We're not just doing a one plant. So all of the traditional planting design tips I talked about last week all relate to these. We're just taking them now and making, a larger composition with them, which is cool. Someone's from Palatine too. Awesome. All our Chicago folks. So yeah, the Lowry Garden is one of those amazing places. And like I said, it's pretty close. If you get a chance to go to Millennium Park, it's definitely worth it. It's just fun. And this design is by Piet Oudolf, and he's a Dutch designer, really well known. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of him. It was already mentioned in the chat. And it's just, oh yeah, the High Line in New York is a drift garden. And Peg, have you been there? I have not been there yet. And I would love to go to the High Line in New York. That's another great example of a drift plant that Piet Oudolf designed, which is awesome. Yeah, Megan just said it's amazing. Yes, yes, yes. So yeah, I'm jealous of all of you. I haven't even been to New York, which is amazing. I still need to get to New York, which is unfortunate that I haven't been there. So here's some other examples of drift plantings. What I love about this is that you can see the colors are repeated. So obviously color is important here. And if you get close, you can see texture is important also. And there's some spiky plants in some areas and some moundy plants in others. So we're still doing form, texture, color, but they're being elongated and they're being repeated all the way down. Like, this is an amazing design. Is this the coolest thing? I mean, they're really thinking about making sure the colors are consistent and there's a theme happening here and it's pulled together. I always think it's funny when someone says to me, they're like, this garden is so natural. Really, it's not natural because we've been designing it. But if you see us as part of nature, I guess it is. But it's amazing and beautiful. And yeah, and Janet's saying it's relaxing. It's exactly what it is. So drift plantings, you often see them in these larger contexts, but you can do drift planting in a residential area too. You need a little bit of space, but you don't have to have humongous areas to do it. It might be a cross between a drift planting and a mixed border if you're doing it in your own yard, but if you have a small yard anyway. So here's another drift planting. This is pushing it a little bit more. This looks like there's a lot of one type of plant here, but there are some other ones in there also. So this is just a little bit different feel of a drift planting. And of course, let's talk about drift designers while we're at it. Someone already mentioned Piet Oudolf. He does drift planting design. He's got a lot of great books. I would definitely encourage you to look at those. And there was a documentary that came out with him, was that 2 years ago, maybe? I cannot remember the name of it. Maybe one of you remembers the name of it. My partner and I sat down and we watched it. It was free. So it was like a one-time deal for us to watch it for free. So we watched it, and his background's in music. And I think it's pretty cool that my partner now knows who Piet Oudolf is. And we're going to probably go to the Netherlands next year to visit his family, not Piet's, but my partner's family. And I'm hoping we get to go see Piet Oudolf's nursery while we're there. I'm crossing my fingers. We'll see if it happens. But oh, 5 Season Garden. Is that the name of the documentary, Leah? But it's a great documentary on Piet Oudolf. You should definitely look at it. It was fun to watch that. And then Noel Kingsbury is another drift planter. And actually, Noel and Piet Oudolf write books together all the time. And actually, the book that I have here is Piet Oudolf and Noel Kingsbury. And they work together a lot in terms of writing. But that's another person you can look at. And there's a lot of other drift designers all over the world. Omi van Sweden, the one that I showed you earlier in here, is one that's been around since I was in school. They were pretty well known back then. And then, these other designers have popped up also, but it's fun. It's fun to see their work. I love drift design. It's really beautiful. And it's hard. I mean, it can be hard to get established. Any garden is, but it's just fun to see it. Okay, so that is drift planting. So let's go to one that's a little maybe new to some of you, maybe not. Maybe some of you do know matrix plantings, but let's talk about matrix planting. Another one of my very favorite types of planting models. So here are two pictures. We don't, for those that know matrix planting, if you know what I'm talking about, let's see what you think about this. But between A and B, what do you think could be a matrix planting if you're just looking at the word matrix and wondering what that means? Now, the only thing I can tell you to give you a hint is one of them you should know already. So you could probably pull out the other one, and then what's left would be the matrix planting. Hopefully, we'll find out. We'll find out. But I am going to be curious when as everyone's typing in their answers, have any of you heard of matrix planting? Tell me yes or no, like if you've heard of this term before, because it was pretty new to me when I had heard the term. Oh, some have, most no. And you're like me, I had not heard of it until like 6 or 7 years ago, that term. I mean, I'd heard it before in terms of an ecological word, but not in terms of horticulture. Oh, wonderful. This is awesome. So where are we at, Alicia? Are we doing good?
We have about 67% of the people have voted. So if anyone else wants to get your vote in, go ahead and hurry and get that in. And we are at 30% A and 70% B.
Okay, awesome. And I'm looking at the chat here. Eileen, prairies are matrix plantings, and that's Iowa. Yes, that is correct. That is correct.
So we just hit 70%. So we're going to go ahead and end the poll. We're
Awesome.
Still at 30% A and 70% B.
Awesome. So we have mostly people are saying B is a matrix planting. And I want to make sure when we talk about matrix, I should have actually brought Kelly Norris's book up here. I don't know why I always forget these things. Probably because I was running up here to do this talk. But the matrix planting, okay, here let's get the answer here first. So B is the matrix planting. So what is A? Anybody want to just throw that in there while we're talking about matrix planting? What is A? Does anybody know? We've already talked about it. Mixed border. Awesome. Yay, you know your different planting models. Awesome. It is a mixed border because they're in smaller little areas, like little clumps, not like the elongated ones. So matrix plant, there's different ways you can explain this. So when I learned about matrix plantings, it was in an ecological sense. And when I was in the LA landscape architecture department, and Eileen had mentioned this with prairie, matrix is usually a you can use, okay, in terms of ecology, the way we learned it was the matrix was a dominant landscape form. So in Iowa, today, the matrix would probably be agriculture because that's the dominant plants or the ground cover in Iowa. In the old days, it would be prairie, but if you just look, so that's the larger scale. If you look at just a prairie planting, you can also explain the prairie planting as being a matrix because there's a dominant plant, which is grasses. So you can look at it in terms of the entire state and say, what is the dominant landscape or the ground cover, or you can look at it in terms of a garden and say, what is the dominant plant? So in this one on the right, the dominant plant, I mean, this is a little equal in this planting, but oftentimes grasses are the dominant plant in a matrix planting. So when Eileen mentioned prairie, that's a great example of that. When we put ecology and horticulture together, we want to make things look beautiful also. So you will often use something like a grass, like a carex or an ornamental grass. I know carex is not necessarily a grass. And then you have that as a dominant species, and then you punctuate it with primary plants. Okay, so the one on the right is kind of doing that. You have this primary kind of grassy type plant, and then you're punctuating it with these other primary plants. So instead of having all primary, now you're not doing drifts either necessarily. It's kind of a, like, I see it as like a carpet of a grass or a matrix plant, and then you punctuate it with other things. I don't know if that makes sense, but we'll look at more examples here so you can see that. So here's another great example. I showed this earlier when I was showing the primary plants, but basically you're dominated by some plant. Usually it's a grass or a sedge. It doesn't have to be, but oftentimes that's usually the dominant plant. And that's kind of the backdrop. And we're going to talk at the end. If we have time, we may not, we're actually getting towards the end now. I might just zip through the end really quick, but encourage you to read some things more about this. But the matrix planting, those grasses are the workhorse of the garden. They're the ones that keep the weeds down. So I know last week someone had mentioned that they said, isn't it okay not to mass plants? Can't we just leave plants? Can't we just leave plants into onesies? Like, I like my plants spread apart. If you're someone that likes your plants spread apart, maybe you keep the larger plants spread apart, but then you put like a matrix on the ground plane like this that helps keep the weeds down. And maybe they're really low. And a matrix can be very simple, like a monocultural block. Maybe the matrix layer is a monocultural block, and maybe you have different primary plants on the top, or you can make it very complicated. Kelly Norris does a great job of explaining this. The matrix part can be a mix of carex and heuchera and like other ground hugging type plants, which we'll talk more about when we talk about design plant communities. But it's really kind of a neat system, and it's beautiful. So this is what I'm trying to establish in our backyard, is a matrix, and I've been doing it in my front yard in the right of way between the sidewalk and the street. I actually have grasses and alliums. One of the things I love about matrix plantings is that the grasses always look nice, okay? And then you have to play around with the other primary plants to make sure that they're taking turns blooming. And one thing that Roy Diblick does, for those that know Roy Diblick, he's a designer out of Wisconsin. He likes to take one type of plant, a cultivar of something. Let's just use alliums as an example, since that's what I use. And you have lots of different alliums. Aesthetically, they all look like alliums, but because they're different cultivars, they take turns blooming. So you can have all grasses, and then you have all these alliums popping out, but they all take turns blooming. So there's always something happening. It's a fun way of doing plants. So matrix is just a different approach to being able to enjoy, like, it's kind of a drift in a bigger way, kind of, not really. I guess the sedges and the grasses are the drifts, and then you have these other plants punctuated in there. But it's fun. So Adam Woodruff, I'll show him, here's one of the designers. These are a lot of his designs. He does a lot of great, beautiful matrix plantings and drift plantings. And then this design is Roy Diblick. This is a matrix planting at the Shed Aquarium in Chicago. So another beautiful, and I won't get into the details of it. There's a lot of cool things that you can do. Oh, Aaron, I should have got pictures of my strip in the front here so you could see it. It's actually filled in really well. It's just crazy how long, it was very fast. Like matrix plantings, you can install really quickly, which is really cool. So some of my favorite matrix designers is Roy Diblick. If you don't have this book, you should get it. It's amazing. I probably refer to this book the most. I just love it. And then Adam Woodruff so Roy Diblick's out of Wisconsin. Adam Woodruff's out of Missouri. So they're both Midwest designers. I love Adam Woodruff's Instagram. You should look at it. He does a lot of annual designs too, like in containers and things, and he does some really cool stuff. So make sure you definitely take a look at that. Awesome. And then the last two I'm going to cover pretty quickly. They're very similar, but salt and pepper. I know we need to give more time. It sounds like we need more time with this, but when you look at these two designs right here, these two plantings, what do you think might be a salt and pepper planting? If you were to guess, are we just going to throw it out there? Here we go.
I did launch the poll. Yes, I gave everyone a little bit more time before I launched it.
Awesome. And Alicia, I know we can decide. I mean, I don't have to go into the design plant communities end of things at the end, because I know I'll go way over if I talk about that. Maybe that's something we do in the future, but I might mention it briefly at the end.
Yeah, I was going to mention we're at 6:58 right now, so we're just about 7 o'clock. So we do understand if anyone needs to leave early. I knew Lisa is a wealth of information, and I knew this talk would go definitely the full hour. So we don't feel bad if anyone needs to leave, but we will stay and finish the presentation.
Awesome. And again, that's one of my problems I have. I'm like, this is never going to take an hour. I'll just throw some extra stuff on the end, and it always does. Isn't that crazy? Okay, I'm curious to see what everybody's got so far.
So we'll give it 5 more seconds on the poll. We have 77% of people in.
Awesome.
Okay, so we ended with 78% of people, 94% said A, and 6% said B.
Oh, so the first one, A, awesome, awesome. You are correct. You are correct. And it's funny, as I was looking at everyone's question, I saw this question. I'm gonna answer this question. Which style occurs most common in nature? It depends on the environment that the plants are in, Jean. I'll talk about this at the end a little bit. Hopefully I'll remember this, but drift plantings might occur in one type of planting. A matrix planting might happen in a different type of area. It depends on the soils, the way the slope is facing. It might depend on where you are in the world. And the book, I mentioned this last week, The Planting in a Post-Wild World, talks about that actually quite a bit, landscape archetypes. And so I'm not sure which one occurs most often. I don't know that particularly. I just know that there are different planting models around the world that occur because of the conditions they're in. So hopefully that helps that question. So to answer this question, A is salt and pepper. And this is a term that I just learned recently when I was at Epcot. About, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I got to do a talk at the Home and Garden Show at Epcot, and I love how they do their evenly mixed annuals. It is very evenly mixed. So it's not a monocultural block. It's almost like taking 2 monocultural blocks and they're just kind of overlapping them. And I just love it. So I've only seen it in annual beds, but obviously you can definitely do this with perennials too. So you can see the monocultural block on the left. And it's just taking the monocultural block and just mixing them evenly. It isn't random. It's definitely very manipulated, but you're definitely doing it in a more mixed way. So it's not a matrix, it's not a randomized planting, but it's definitely a mix evenly of both of them. And again, I saw these at Epcot and I thought, wow, that is an amazing way to do annuals. This is such a different way of doing it. So I'm giving the credit to the Epcot horticulture staff for the design of these. And, you know, when I asked them about it, they said, oh, that's salt and pepper design. Like I should know that. But when I Google it, salt and pepper design does not come up. The only thing that comes up is my blog post that I wrote about 5 years ago on it because of them. But it's a beautiful design. And I just want to make sure I mention it to you because it's not quite random, but it's close to that random model towards the end. So let's talk about randomized now really quick. That is the most blended planting, and here we go. Here's the last two. So which of these is randomized? Hopefully this is an easy one for you. If you're to choose A or B, which one do you think is a randomized planting? I gotta leave it with an easy one, right?
The votes are flying in for this one, so I don't think you tricked anyone.
They all want to go to bed probably. Nice.
Someone said C, and I'm not seeing a C option.
Maybe because they don't agree with either one of these.
Right, maybe they want a do-over.
That's great. Yeah, randomized, I was looking at Marion's comment. I love randomized too. It's really beautiful. I have never actually tried to do it and it looks difficult to me, but it's so beautiful. I saw when I was in Ireland, we saw a really beautiful randomized planting in a botanic garden, and it was in the woodlands, and it was definitely very planted. I mean, it wasn't just wild. It was a lot like the picture here, but it was just so beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Okay, I bet we're done.
Yes, I did just end the poll. We had 98% said A and 2% said B.
Awesome. So A is the randomized planting. B is, I think of B as a monocultural block. You have the grasses in the front and then you have the grasses in the back. But of course, depending on how you explain what you think randomized is, it could be totally different. But someone asks, do English cottage gardens fall into this category? I think of English cottage gardens as being more mixed borders. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some English cottage gardens that do some of this randomized planting. I guess it depends on the designer, but it's how I imagine them being more mixed borders. So yeah, randomized plantings are absolutely amazing. And it's the most intermingled plant model. And I would say it's different from salt and pepper in that salt and pepper, I feel, is more contrived still. Like they're still being very careful about where to plant things. Where randomized, I feel like it's kind of even though they're initially planted that way, they mix, you know, so it's very high density. The plants just kind of intermix and intermingle even more. I have this next one. It says can be achieved through sowing. I'm not sure if I think it can happen. And for those of you that have tried to install a prairie, it's hard to grow things from seed at a large scale because weeds will come through. If you can't burn it like a prairie, it's hard to keep the weeds down. So something like this, you would probably have to plant mostly with forbs, with actual plants. And then you might be able to put some seeds in there, but I think it's hard. It would be hard to keep the weeds down initially. I think you would almost have to put plants in to get started. But yeah, oh yeah, wildflower gardens, Janet. I'm just looking at that. Definitely. That's what it reminds me of. It's like a wildflower garden. So all of these designs that I'm showing you are all by Nigel Dunnett. He is definitely the master of randomized plantings, and they are absolutely beautiful. These are all in the UK, just so you know. But look at this. Isn't this crazy how beautiful this is? And the good news is he has a book now, and I just bought it and I have not read it yet, but I cannot wait to read it because his plantings just mesmerize me. So this is Nigel Dunnett. He's a professor, and I cannot remember what university, but it's in the UK. Very talented. He's been studying these for years. And then here's the book that he wrote just recently. This came out, I don't know if it was this last summer or the summer before, but it was very recent. And again, definitely take a look at that. And the reason I like this book too, I started paging through it, and I can see he covers some basic planting design also, and then talks about his type of planting also. But yeah, I just love this. So definitely look at that. Oh, this is a great question, Kurt. Why doesn't one plant tend to take over? So the next part, which I need to decide if we're going to have time to even look at it, when you study designed plant communities, the idea of one of the principles of design plant communities is you need to pair plants up that are equal in competition. So you don't want to introduce a plant that's going to take over the rest of them. So that's my short answer to your question. It's knowing your plants well enough to make sure you introduce plants that have the same competitive nature, which is hard because we don't always know plants that well to do that. So those are all the planting borders, all the planting models. And one thing I think I'm going to do, I don't think I'm going to go through all of the rest of it because it could be another half an hour, unless you guys want me to, but I don't know if I need to. I think what I like to do is just introduce Caitlin. Yes. I can do it quickly. And for those that need to leave, just leave. I don't want to hold Alicia either. I just feel bad. I'll just kind of go through it quickly. All of the rest of this is from a book that I just mentioned. It's Planting in a Post-Wild World. You can get all this information from that book. I just pulled some important things out. And the reason I'm pulling these out is because I feel like you can use all these planting models with design plant communities. And the randomized one, like we were just talking about, that was such a great question about the competitive plants, because that's one of the things they talk about in design plant communities. And here's the book. Actually, I didn't know I had a picture, so that's perfect. So this is a great book. One of the few books that I've actually read from front to back. Usually I don't read plant books from front to back. I just read them as I need the information. But this is actually a really great book. It talks about the archetypes that we were talking about earlier, like where do common things happen? Why do they happen? Competitiveness, all of these things. And the whole idea of a design plant community is, do we all know what a plant community is? If I were to say, define what a plant, I know I'm not going to give you a lot of time to talk about, but to explain that, but a plant community could be a prairie. It could be, if you're in Minnesota, it could be an evergreen type of forest. I don't know the terms for all of these, but all around the world, there are plant communities that grow naturally in certain areas because of the temperature, because of the soil. Obviously I'm thinking prairie because we know prairie. We have a very specific things. It might be a woodland. It might be a marsh area. It could be, so it just depends on where you live in the community. So that's a plant community. So a designed plant community is taking the idea of a plant community. Now we're designing it for our own backyard. Okay, so that's kind of the idea of design plant communities, taking ecology and horticulture and kind of pulling them together. So there's two things you need to meet when you talk about design plant communities. all the plants must be able to survive that environmental condition. It makes sense. And you would think that would be it. And they have to have the same competitive strategies. So the question that was just asked a little while ago, you don't want one plant taking over all the other ones. We want to make sure they all have the same. And I want to point out, it's not necessarily about native plants. So you can use native plants to start in an area, but you can incorporate other plants as long as they're not invasive type plants. So it's really about the ecological performance of a plant, not where it's from. And again, I'm not going to go a lot into that. I would definitely encourage you to read the book, but I want to make sure you understand it's about plants that are happy together in the same environment with the same conditions. So let's keep going here so I can show you some more things. These plant communities can be formal or informal plantings. These do not have to be informal. They can be very formal, like this. It could be formal garden with clipped hedges. Like I love the idea of, and my own yard's like this. I have some clipped hedges, and then I have matrix plantings, and I have some design plant communities with my shade garden in the back. So I like the mix of a design plant community being informal and formal. So you can do both. And I would definitely encourage you to do that. And maybe I can go through this quicker than I think. 5 principles. I'm going to point these out too, because again, these all relate back to these planting models. You can make them more complicated if you want. If you're someone's like, I love all these complicated things that you can add in a planting model. These are things you can do. So principle 1 is you want to have groups of plants that are related, not just individual plants that are kind of out there. You want to make sure plants that all like shade and dry conditions, or all like sun and wet conditions. You want to make sure they're all together. I know that seems logical, but even I am guilty of going to the store, buying a plant because it's gorgeous, bringing it home, putting it into a border, and then realizing a year later, oh, it has different watering needs than the plants in that bed. And now it just died. So that happens all the time. So it's the idea, like, how do you understand plants so you have all the same plants that need the same conditions? And again, it does not necessarily mean they all have to be native. You can start there. But you can introduce another plant in as long as it's not invasive. So I love this. They don't like to, the idea is not to place plants like objects. Yeah, how am I saying that right? Like furniture, rather. You want to make sure you're working as a community. And make sure that they all like the same habitat, the same soil is the same. Again, these all seem very logical, but we don't always go there. So here's some examples of that. Looking at now, Thomas Rayner and Claudia West are the authors, and this is Thomas Rayner's garden, which I think is really cool. And this is actually, I think this is his front yard. So it's right along the sidewalk. You can see the sidewalk to the left. But again, these are not individually spaced and they're far apart. They're all crammed in there. They're creating a community. And the idea is to let them evolve and work their way into this community and help each other, not just you going in and pruning them. And, you know, I mean, you're going to have to weed some of this stuff sometimes, but honestly, long term, my old garden was like this. Long term, you don't see the weeds, or they can't compete with the other plants. One of the things they mentioned in this book is if you don't choose the plants, nature will. So I like that idea. So here's some other examples of, you know, plant communities. And I love this example because it's a more structured, formal garden. So you can do design plant communities, drift plantings, matrix plantings, randomized plantings. You can do them in a very structured, you know, element like this, or a room like this. It doesn't always have to be natural. When I say natural, of course, with quotes, it doesn't have to be these windy roads and windy beds and things. It can be very structured if you want it to be. So principle 2, this is a good one. Someone asked this last week, if I remember correctly. Someone asked about the soil, your soils, and what if you have clay soils, or what if you have dry soils, or whatever. Principle 2 of a design plant community is you want to take advantage of the soils and the site conditions that you have. So if you have clay soils, see if you can find plants that enjoy clay soils. If you have really wet soils, are there plants that like wet soils? Instead of adding soil to your site or providing irrigation or doing something to alter the site, what kind of plants can you grow that'll like those conditions? So for me, I don't like to water my plants. And so over the years, I have learned which plants can handle full sun without a lot of water and full shade without a lot of water. And I just keep adding my plant palette to that. I'm not saying you do need to establish plants, and I do water them a lot the first year to get them established. But once they're established, I try not to spend a lot of time to the hose outside. So it's one of those things. Yeah. And Caitlin, if you are starting from scratch, I do water my plants at first to get them established. So definitely do that. But then once they're established, hopefully you can step back. And at that point, I kind of let's see what plants survive and which don't. That's why I like alliums so much now. I've learned that alliums can handle wet and dry conditions. So I do tend to have a lot of alliums because of that, but I know they're gorgeous. I can have lots of different cultivars, lots of different blooms. They always look great, and I don't have to worry about them dying, which is really nice. Of course, I have other plants too. Oh, no, amendments. Oh yeah, if you're starting from scratch, no, you don't have to. And actually, she had asked if you need to amend the soils if you're starting from scratch. Roy Diblick in particular talks about how he doesn't even rip up, like if he's going to put a bed where there is lawn, he will kill off the lawn and then wait. If you're using something like Roundup, you have to wait enough time for it to be gone. We've been using just old cardboard, and we put it on the lawn and let it die after a few days. He doesn't even get rid of the lawn. He actually plants into the dead lawn. And then he claims, and I do believe him more now that I've done my front right of way. He claims that after you put the plants in the lawn, within a year, if you plant it densely enough, the plants will cover the dead lawn. The dead lawn actually acts as a mulch. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, probably in the short term, but the lawn actually keeps the weeds down. So yeah, you don't have to amend your soils, but you have to make sure you find plants that can grow in your soils. That's the trick. Kelly Norris also learned this when he did his front yard. He just wrote the book, New Naturalism, and he just lives a couple miles down the road from me. So I get to go over there to see how his plants are doing. And one of the things he says he regrets is rototilling his front yard before he put the plants in, because he's had some major issues with weeds. I think he's finally getting them under control, but he's had some major issues with that. So if you don't have to change the soils, if you can work with what you got, I know it's pie in the sky, but if you can, that's awesome. Okay, so that's stress as an asset. And you're going to have less plants because of it, most likely. You may not be able to have 50 plants. Maybe you pick a good 5 plants that'll grow in that stressed out area. So here's some examples of that. Like here's more of a Mediterranean dry feel. Like, a lot of Mediterranean plants have that silvery, and you'll find this, like certain plants look a certain way if they're shady or if they're dry and hot, or it's really actually kind of cool how that works. So here's plants for more wet conditions. And it's funny how you kind of know plants by their area, by what they look like. And obviously shade garden plants also. So again, I think a lot of us think of in terms of shade and sun, but maybe not always about the soil or the dryness. So I think if you can consider that also. So principle 3, layering plants vertically. This is an important one, and I talk about this a lot. We just mentioned a little bit with the matrix planting, but it's basically if you cannot keep bare soil. Okay, so the idea is not necessarily to use mulch, but to use plants themselves to create these layers and keep down the plants that you don't want. I'm not against mulch at all. I actually use mulch in the beginning, in the first year, but the goal is for me long-term is as the plants fill in, you use less mulch. Okay, so there's the quote, if you don't fill your spaces, the weeds will. You just know it's going to happen. So instead of having plants side by side, you want to have them on top of each other. Kelly Norris says that you want to have like 110% fill of plants in your beds because you're actually overlaying them on top of each other. It sounds crazy, but it's actually true. So here's the layers of a design plant community. You have your ground cover, you have a seasonal fun theme, and then you have woody plants, the structure layer. And what I want to cover here is this functional layer at the bottom. This is called the green mulch. Those are those smaller plants like we had mentioned, calyxes. You can use any rhizomatous plants that hug the ground, that cover the ground, are going to be great for that ground cover layer. Like I said, calyx, we use a lot of different grasses. I've used coral bells, I've used tiarella, and I mix them. So you want to have a mix of those to keep the weeds down. They're really a functional layer. Now, they're not necessarily there for aesthetics, even though they look beautiful. It's the top layers that are the aesthetics, and it's the bottom layers that they call them the functional workhorse, that matrix layer at the bottom. So again, I showed this picture last week. If you have empty beds, weeds are going to pop up. That's what happens. You want to have you want to have a layer like this. So here's a woodland area, and you can see you don't have a lot of bare soil in most natural settings of plant materials, which is cool. And then here's another great, a Northwind perennial farm. Has anybody been to Northwind in Wisconsin? This is Roy Diblick's farm, his nursery. So this is a beautiful nursery. You can get some really cool, you get a lot of carex species here, the sedges that are in this picture, these little sedges in the middle of the hostas. He grows a lot of those because he does a lot of matrix plantings. But if you have not been to Northwind in Burlington, Wisconsin, you need to take a trip there. It is fun. Oh, somebody has, awesome. It's a great place to go. This is a great picture to show that when you're drawing in plan view, which is from the sky looking down, and you put plants off to the side like this, you're really not layering your plants. Because if you look at it in elevation in the bottom view, the plants really are not, these are really not doing anything. So making sure that you actually put plants below plants, so you're actually covering that ground. And then here's a greater picture of that. They call it green mulch. That's that lower level to make sure that you're, so if you're someone that likes to have your plants far apart, maybe it's the shrubs or the taller plants that are far apart, but maybe you have this functional ground cover layer to help you keep those weeds down, which is fun. Yes, Caitlin, I think this is a great way to try to work with to establish a healthy woodland garden. That's a great idea. So this is a picture again of Thomas Rayner's garden. Again, you can see kind of that mix of, it's hard to sometimes see the green mulch, but that lower level, making sure you have plants under plants to make sure that you actually fill that up. Now, this is one of my favorite principles. Principle 4, make it attractive and legible. So the idea here is when you drive by someone's house and they have this wild front yard, you're like, oh my gosh, they need to mow that. That looks horrible. So by making it attractive and legible, people are more willing to accept these more ecologically based plantings. So you can do that with, here, actually, I'm going to show you some examples really quick. You want to make sure that you do things like having hardscapes next to it, maybe having a clipped lawn, maybe having a hedge. Like that's one of my favorite things. I love having a clipped hedge as an edge, but then I have these really wild plantings in front because I love that. And for the public, they see them, they're like, oh, someone's taking care of that. They call it cues for care. I don't know if you can see that. You give plants an orderly frame, so it looks like someone's actually taking care of it. And people are more willing to accept it. If that's something you need, like if you want something in your front yard and you're worried about, you know, having it be orderly, maybe you mix some really fun wild plantings with some more orderly frames or some of these cues to care to be able to hopefully have people be more accepting, and maybe they want to try it too, which would be awesome. So here's some other cues to care, more orderly frames. Like maybe you can plant them, like we talked about these planting models. This is a great example of it. Looks like a monocultural block, but maybe that lower level, I don't know if there's anything more besides that grass, but maybe you just have the red twig dogwoods in the top, which is your monocultural block, but maybe the matrix or the ground cover layer underneath is actually a mix of like 4 or 5 different plants doing the functional work of keeping those weeds down, but aesthetically, it still looks really cool. So that's why it's important to know what the planting models are, because you can start to combine planting models and these different vertical layers to achieve the aesthetics end of things that you want to do also, which is fun. And then this is just a great example of how, I'm not saying you have to have a clip lawn, and I know some people are against the lawn, but lawns can give you that legibility that you need sometimes. So maybe you have this really fun drift planting or matrix planting, and by just having a clip lawn up to it, there's something about that, like, oh yeah, now I'm more accepting of that wild part. If it's somebody that, if that's what you want. Like I said, we don't even have lawn because we can't grow it here, but it's just a nice addition sometimes to a more of a wild planting. So here, this is at Chanticleer Garden on the East Coast, and again, beautiful planting design. And by putting these stones in here, that's what gives it legibility. It makes it look like it was designed, and you're like, oh yeah, this is pretty awesome. And I love this one too. So someone mentioned a woodland garden. Like, look at how cool this is. Having the steps and these stone walls and these little pillars, it's so simple, but now you just gave that landscape legibility, because now it looks like a human was there and actually designed it, even though I'm sure they started designing it, but eventually if you plan it right, things will just kind of maneuver around on their own, which is really cool. I love that. And this is at Roy Diblick's farm at Northwind Perennial Farm in Wisconsin. They have a lot of these cool like architectural features, which is a great way to add, again, some legibility to a design. And then the last principle I want to mention is the idea that we're managing gardens and not maintaining them. This is a new term in the industry. A lot of you may have heard that it's about managing the community, not maintaining each individual plant. So the idea is if the plant starts taking over, maybe we need to manage the community, decide maybe that plant shouldn't be there. Maybe we need to replace it with another one, or maybe take it out so the rest of the community can thrive. So we want to make sure that we're not just maintaining one plant, but we're managing the community as a whole. And I won't go into that because I know there's a lot of, we don't want to do any of these things in the long run. I'm not saying none of us do it. I do clip my hedge. I love my hedge, but I also put it with other things to do my matrix plantings and those types of things also. I like mixing all of these models and all these principles, which is fun. And we're getting back to the end. I think we're right at the end now. So these are all just really pretty pictures. This is Roy Diblick's garden here on the right, the Art Institute in Chicago, because he's done a lot in the Chicagoland area. And he actually provided the plans for the Lowry garden. Him and Roy Diblick worked, or him and Pete Outhoff worked together for that. This is another designer, Heiner Luz. I don't know a lot about him, but that's another drift planter that you can look at in Germany also. Heiner Luz. Here, there's this L-U-Z. And then here's Roy Diblick again, which is awesome. Okay, I went over a lot and I apologize for that. But I tried to summarize their book really quickly, but I would, if you're interested in all of these, I would definitely look at Rayner's and West's book and get more of this information, and then take the planting models and then do some of like overlapping different planting models when you're doing some of these design plant communities. Thank